The city of Bristol has commemorated one of its residents more than any other. John Cabot's name has been given to a tower, a school, and the latest landmark to bear his name is Cabot Circus, one of the largest shopping centres in the UK. Cabot lived in Bristol for just 4 years. His modern-day notoriety comes from his skill as a trader and as an explorer. It was Cabot, rather than his more famous contemporary Christopher Columbus, who first landed on 15th century North America. So why has his name been given to a shopping centre? John Cabot was born Giovanni Caboto in Genoa, Italy in 1451, in the same city and the same year as Columbus. At a young age, Cabot moved to Venice, gaining citizenship in 1476, which entitled him to engage in maritime trade. Over the next decade, he travelled and traded extensively around the Mediterranean and became an experienced sailor and navigator. When Cabot was born, Genoa and particularly Venice were the powerhouses of the European economies. They controlled a vast monopoly on the lucrative spice trade with the Far East. Oriental spices were in huge demand in Western Europe as they could transform bland medieval food into a culinary delight. Mwah. This economy collapsed in 1453 when the Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople, cutting off the trade routes with the Far East. The European monopolies crumbled, the trade of spices decreased dramatically. By the late 1480s, Cabot was in financial difficulties, feeling the pinch of this new economic climate. He left Venice insolvent and moved to Valencia in Spain in 1488, pursued by his creditors. Having abandoned his mercantile roots, he was forced to pursue other professions. He proposed improvements to Valencia's harbour, which were rejected. He was also contracted to build a bridge in Seville, which was cancelled. As Cabot was struggling, news spread in 1492 that Christopher Columbus had successfully crossed the Atlantic. Columbus was convinced that he had landed on an island off the coast of Asia, but he had actually discovered the Caribbean. It's probable that Cabot met Columbus in Valencia after his first expedition, and being the more experienced trader, he would have realised that the items that Columbus had brought back weren't, in fact, from the Orient. Spurred on by Columbus's success, Cabot now decided to try and gain support for an Atlantic expedition himself. He approached the Portuguese, but they had backed Vasco da Gama, who was busy exploring Africa. He also approached the Spanish, who were unwilling to finance him. King Ferdinand was waiting to hear back from Columbus, who was still occupied with the Caribbean. Still looking for patronage in 1495, Cabot moved to Bristol and rented a house on this street. Bristol is ideally located to explore the Atlantic, and local fishermen had been doing so for over a decade, with expeditions in 1480 and 1481. Unlike his contemporaries, Cabot favoured sailing a more northerly route across. This was faster and had the bonus of not aggravating England's more powerful neighbours, namely Spain and Portugal. Cabot eventually gained an audience with King Henry VII to try and obtain patronage for his expedition. Henry's enthusiasm for the project led him to grant letters patent which gave Cabot permission to sail, and although Cabot wasn't a particularly religious man, he would have been blessed by a priest before he left, as was the custom. Cabot came here to St Mary Raycliffe Church, which had long been associated with the port of Bristol, ever since the Anglo-Saxon beginnings of the city. Cabot's first attempt was a disaster. He barely made it past Ireland before being forced to turn back due to bad weather. A year later, in May 1497, Cabot tried again. This time he set off in his own purpose-built ship, the Matthew. And a replica of the Matthew is here in Bristol. This boat would have accommodated a crew of around 19 men, and life at sea would have been incredibly tough. We know that Cabot ran into at least one Atlantic storm, which would have been a life-threatening and terrifying experience. The crew also had to stomach a diet of dried peas and beans and maggot-infested hard biscuits. As stored water became stale, beer was the beverage of choice, the allowance of which was a gallon a day. After 34 days at sea, Cabot and his men sighted land off what is now Newfoundland, Canada. Cabot went ashore. After navigating over 2,000 miles of treacherous water, Cabot's arrival on the continent of North America was an underwhelming spectacle. He claimed the land for England and Christian Europe, but spent only a few hours ashore, preferring instead to make observations from the safety of his boat. On arriving back in Bristol, Cabot, eager to see the king, rushed the customary rituals. He then left for London, covering the distance in less than 3 days. King Henry was impressed, and he gave Cabot £10, which was the equivalent to 2 years' wages for an ordinary labourer. He also gave him permission to mount another, much larger expedition. Cabot now became something of a celebrity. He was called the Great Admiral. He was also granted a comfortable pension. The first known document to include the name America is this 1507 map of the world by Martin van Zee Müller, and it's generally accepted that the name derives from Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci. But there is a theory that the continent is named after one of Cabot's financial backers and the principal owner of the Matthew, a Bristol-based merchant called Richard Amaric. In May 1498, Cabot prepared 5 ships for a further trade expedition to America. This would be his final voyage. 3 years after Cabot set out, a Portuguese expeditionary party discovered Native Americans in possession of an Italian-made sword and, intriguingly, 2 Venetian rings. But ultimately, the fate of the fleet remains a mystery. Although John Cabot was based in Bristol for only 4 years, his work defined the city for the next 500. His counterpart Columbus sailed to the New World with the intent of colonising its inhabitants, but Cabot's motivations were mercantile. Bristol had long been a trading port, yet it was Cabot who pioneered the Atlantic sailing routes that others would then exploit, causing the fortunes of the city to become increasingly linked to the highs and the lows of the global economy. John Cabot has been commemorated elsewhere in bricks and mortar, but it's here at Cabot Circus where his life and his legacy have become truly embodied.